I'm the type of person that always turns to video games when I'm feeling down. They don't need to make me happy. I enjoy the cathartic release of a sad or frustrating game just as much. This week though, I want to play an actually bad game and review it. My first video was my favorite game of all time, and that video was doing some numbers. So I felt it was only fair, balance the karma, I need to do a bad game. And this is YouTube. Negative reviews are generally more entertaining. The problem is I don't really play bad games. I've been critical of games my whole life, and I'm really good at spotting a bad game from afar. Obviously I could just dunk on some low-hanging fruit that everyone knows is bad, like Final Fantasy 13, the David Cage games.
No, get out! There's no mesh stars in here!
I could go after some indie game that really never stood a chance, but I don't think those would be very interesting to talk about. I want a game that's, you know what, maybe not even a bad game. Maybe just a game that is lacking in some critical features that would be more interesting to talk about than a game I just universally praise. But what? Popular developer, cult-like following, mountains of accolade, and a contrarian opinion.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
So just to clarify obvious bit of context, yes, there is a boss named Giraffe, which is very cool. However, this is a mistranslation. It's actually Jirafu, which is an old Japanese name. Very nice, but it will not affect the assessment. What will affect my assessment is that this is a From Software game and I'm a massive fan. There was some discourse when this game came out and a bunch of people immediately bounced off of it. People were saying, hey, this isn't Samurai Souls, this is some weird bullshit, this sucks. And the other side just said that but said good at the end. Whether or not you can even compare it to the Soulsborne series is contested sometimes. I blame this on Activision, because I hate Activision. And not just because they grafted Blizzard onto themselves, but because they let Prototype die. In reality, they just published the game. They didn't even do an awful job. The actual gameplay trailers clearly show what the game was gonna be, but people like me still went in thinking, oh boy, this'll put Neo to shame. But we didn't even get Samurai Souls, so what did we get? Sekiro is a fast-paced action game which uniquely focuses on deflection and counterattacks to defeat enemies. The combat flow is unique as enemies don't really leave openings after attacks. They can just keep chaining attacks together, and if the player can deflect and get some counter hits in, they will eventually break the enemy's stance and get a critical hit. Instant death on most enemies, with bosses requiring multiple. The only other games I know of with this concept are Way of the Passive Fist, a really fun indie beat-em-up, and Fury, which I'll probably review on its own. I think FromSoft fucking hates Dark Souls. Every time they get an opportunity to experiment, they just rip out mechanics from the Dark Souls formula. They clearly have some vision of how they want their games, but the horrid little creatures buying their game keep finding ways around it. They absolutely hate heavy armor and great shield playstyles, which they removed when making Bloodborne. So okay, they want players dodging, parrying, but they also want aggressive play, so they added the health regain feature to Bloodborne. They seem to like active fights. They don't want people hanging out behind a shield or backing off too often, which is seen in Dark Souls 3, where bosses are so aggressive, I'd argue the stamina mechanic has started to lose its purpose. I mean really, when I play Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring, I'm not paying attention to that shit. Sekiro doesn't even have stamina, so they're clearly not that interested in the mechanic anymore. But DS3 and Bloodborne are great. Bloodborne especially is my favorite they've ever made, and they still found ways to give the player some freedom despite the restrictions. I guess that wasn't good enough for them, because Sekiro takes like 5 steps further. Into the bathroom to dump ass on my lap. This game not only has no armor, but you also only get one weapon. You don't level up aside from some flat upgrades like a Zelda. Your options are block and basic sword swipes. Honestly, that's 90% of the game. The last 10% are extremely situational, like the Mikiri counter for thrusting attacks or the lightning counter you get late into the game. The most interesting aspect is the shinobi tools. powered by the souls of orphans. There's also a skill tree for some reason, but I did some research on this and only the Mickery counter appears to be important. The rest probably work against like one enemy or one attack in the game you'd never care about, so they really aren't messing around anymore. They want you to play the game exactly the way they want to make it. No equipment, no level grinding, just perfectly timed blocks, couple sword swipes, repeat. And what do they have to show for it? Well, the enemies are actually as, if not better, than enemies in the other FromSoft games, since the main defense is just, blocking, parrying. The enemy can kind of be and do anything, and you're not going to get Fire Giant or Melania problems. So what if the attack is too big? You should just press L2. What if there's 15 consecutive attacks? Just 15 consecutive L2s. This is pretty neat and allows the devs to go nuts with the enemies. Usually when a Japanese person goes nuts, they burn down a building or release a bunch of poisonous gas I guess they just had lying around. So they severely limited the player's options in combat, but that allowed them to craft more far-out enemies. I'd say that's a fair trade, but that doesn't fully save it. For all the good ideas they had, it's just a more restrictive version of what they had. They so desperately want control, so they can perfectly and finally craft the game they envision, that they don't realize they're strangling the player. And players don't like being strangled unless they're at their local BDSM warehouse. I took a human sexuality class once, and during the BDSM unit they brought in this TLC star to talk about it. She described these big BDSM meetups having little curtained rooms you could just peruse. You'd see some ball spanking and then go to the next one and see a rich guy being led around on a leash. And this made me really think, and I wanted to raise my hand and say, "Ma'am, you're really fucking fat." But I didn't. They went too far in trying to achieve a vision, and plenty of people didn't react well. You'll probably find more fans than haters, simply because the bulk of gamers stop playing and never think of most games again. The casual consumer doesn't really have loyalty and will quickly sour and move on from a game that doesn't hit the right buttons. Which is just fair, I'm pressing the buttons on the controller, so the game should be pressing the G-spot in my ass. Combat is so inflexible. You try and deflect attacks and counter with a couple sword swings, but not to deal damage, but build towards the stance break. The vision FromSoft so coveted was for the boss to literally just wail on the player with all of its spinning, dancing combos while the player hopefully learns the pattern and survives till the stance break. That's it. You are a captive audience to the boss's interpretive dance recital, only helped by getting to kill them at the end. This is the reason pros and speedrunners of Sekiro agree on calling it a sort of rhythm game. You just need to press block and attack with the right timing, and maybe a Mickery counter or lightning counter depending on the enemy. And rhythm games are really inflexible, so Sekiro kind of suffers here, but it's not purely a rhythm game, it's not that far gone. The shinobi tools are uniquely useful in a lot of ways. Sometimes you can even cheese bosses, it's great. I remember being super hyped when I discovered the firecracker tool worked on Jirafu, because I was actually stuck there for a while. Stealth and assassinations are the big way you get through the levels, since this game suffers a lot more than other FromSoft games when trying to fight multiple enemies. What's cool is you can be a little scummy and get some free critical hits on a lot of the mini-bosses by sneaking up on them. There are multiple paths you can take freely, which are also nice. I always got stuck going down one and just switched over to the other. Then I'd get stuck on the other path and realize it was time for me to get serious and go to bed. And all these little things are well and good, but it doesn't help you when you finally get into combat and it's back to B-Way Hero World Tour for the Wii. The campaign is still pretty fair. The game scales up well from basic enemies to stronger but similar mini-bosses and then the proper bosses. The game might be a wall, but you can't say it doesn't give you a learning curve. The level design is fine. I never got lost or confused on where to go, but it's pretty linear. This definitely came out after Dark Souls 3, that amazing interconnected map of yonder years is long gone. This is a good point to bring up, but linear progression is fine. It's completely inoffensive. It's just stopping short of making something great. And that's what Sekiro's campaign is. It doesn't have major progression flaws. It just put the effort elsewhere. So let's not forget the actual purpose of a FromSoft game is that thrill of conquering a challenge, the sound design and animation for finally getting that stance break and the critical hit. I mean, it's always been good in FromSoft games, and it's no different here. The only issue with this is there can be a loss of progression in fights that straight up blue balls you. You work super hard getting an enemy close to stance breaking, but if you make enough mistakes or otherwise waste time, a lot of their posture can recover. So beating enemies should be done in one string if possible. You don't get a lot of opportunity to back off. This is good for keeping the player active, but it's deflating to see some of your hard work just actually disappear. Like, even if you messed up and had to eat multiple Estus in Dark Souls 3, the damage you dealt doesn't go away. They save that bullshit for Elden Ring. I think it would have been better for enemies to only regain stance from hitting the player, so actually more like Melania from Elden Ring. That way you'd have more freedom to back off every so often before re-engaging. You know, like a different strategy or something, I don't know. I'm just trying to pad time since I've got to sound really critical for a while, so let me catch my breath. The main flaw with Sekiro is that the deflection mechanic is poorly designed and actively punishes the player without properly teaching itself. In general, the telegraphs for enemies are totally fine. I think some attacks, like the Blazing Bull's charge and some weird motions out of the Headless Ape Man, leave a bit to be desired on knowing when the hit actually occurs, but situational things like that are minor. The main issue is the player. That's right, you. The player character, anyway. Also, did you ever notice in the opening cutscene when we first see Wolf as a child, he has like an adult face? I mean, at least he grew into it. The actual main issue is that despite being so strict on how you play the game, it doesn't really teach you how to do so, not properly. The deflection mechanic is very simple and actually more forgiving than the Dark Souls roll. The invincibility of the Dark Souls roll and the deflection frames for the Sekiro block are identical. But the Sekiro block is still a block, so if you react too soon, you can still block the attack. The issue is this. This is what kills the game for so many people. You can spam the block button very fast, just like in Dark Souls. However, in Sekiro, the block is also the deflection, so they had to do something to prevent the accursed player from mashing block and deflecting every attack. Their solution was to decrease the active frames if you just blocked but didn't deflect anything. So if you mash block 2 times, the second block will have a smaller window to deflect an attack. This can stack until you literally can't deflect anything. You can still block, but blocking versus deflecting an attack affects the enemy's behavior. On some attacks, the enemy will straight up be thrown off balance when deflected. This leaves the player mashing block, not understanding any mechanics and thinking, okay, I should get an opportunity after this attack, they should be thrown off balance. But they don't. And you can get monkeypox. There's no tutorial to dissuade this or an animation difference. I actively believe the main reason people bounced off this game, especially people who liked previous Souls games and bounced off of this, was that they want you to use deflection like the Dark Souls roll. Well timed and with a single button press, having the block as a safety net for failure. The problem is the speed of the game naturally puts the player on edge and makes them jittery, and the fast block animation just allows them to form bad habits. This is a deeper problem that also plagues Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. In those games, the roll is so fast, you just spam it multiple times as soon as you feel endangered, but the roll doesn't lose iframes from spamming. You didn't do this at all in Dark Souls 1 or even 2 because the game's speed was more manageable and the roll had this long recovery. I think Sekiro should have been slower or given the block a cooldown. Like, you can pull it up real fast, but it takes a second to put it back down unless you actually deflect or block an attack. The correct way to play Sekiro is to time your parry the same as a Dark Souls 3 roll, but hold the button for just a beat. That way you don't get penalized for spamming block, and even if you miss the parry, you still block. If the game's mechanics communicated this a little better, or if they just spelled it out in a tutorial at the start of the game, I think plenty of people would have done better from the beginning. The game is very polished mechanically, but I don't think the player interaction was looked at enough. They needed to revisit the opening of the game and cement the correct playstyle into the player's head. I actually had a pretty good idea for this, which I'm using in all the footage I got for this game. I just remapped the controls so that block is on B, or circle. Then I played the game like a Dark Souls, hitting B with the same timing I would to dodge roll. And wouldn't you know it, it just works. Having the most important button be L2 is really awkward. I believe the most pressed buttons should always be the face buttons or the right-handed shoulder buttons. These are the most convenient to press, and that's how all the other FromSoft games do it. If the default controls were more like this, players might pick up on the playstyle a little better. Honestly, I might just remove the dash feature entirely. I mean, Japan is such a small country, where do you need to go that fast? It's good for avoiding certain attacks like grabs, but it could easily be reworked out of the game. Maybe your sword attack could counter grabs. You know, that makes sense. They try and grab you, that just leaves them open to getting stabbed. It's like a woman's self-defense course. Then you have a perfect rock, paper, scissors combat system, deflection for normal attacks, sword swing versus grabs, and jump over sweeps. The main problem this all stems from is that FromSoft always starts with a base of Dark Souls. They then hammer it into whatever new shape they have in mind. The only reason Sekiro would have block on L2 and dash on B given their importance is because that's where parry and roll are in Dark Souls. They don't build their games from the ground up. If they did, they probably would have made something way better than my little idea. I think Sekiro is actually a lot closer to being a truly great, truly innovative, and truly unique game than I gave it credit for. And with that, I think it's time for some final thoughts. I'm honestly surprised. I was expecting to be a lot more negative. I mean, I chose this game specifically to have a negative review. There's a weird phenomenon where you just think a game sucks or is clunky, but all it takes is like 5 minutes seeing how it's done to understand, oh, this game is like a completely unique playstyle I wasn't getting. I mean, that's how I got into Dark Souls. I was playing that shit like a hack and slash until I saw people playing cautiously and reactionary. I could make a video just on this, but I'll save that and just say, it's always a game's duty to teach itself to the player. As laudable as innovation is, you can't sacrifice the basics without consequences. If you want something brand new from the ground up, you need to be prepared to teach it to the player from the ground up. Portal has one of the most unique mechanics of all time, and it spares no effort teaching it. All of its applications are covered before it takes off the training wheels and expects you to start combining them and really racking your brain to use them. I really wanted to like Sekiro when it came out, and I really wanted to dislike it when I picked it up for this review. I got disappointed both times. I still think Sekiro could be called a bad game in some context, but now I see there is a great game inside of here. I just wish the game was better at showing it. Thanks for watching up till now. I hope you got something out of this, and hey, if you're interested, why not subscribe for more? If I get 10 subscribers, the zoo said they might fix my gate so I can graze again. Until then, it's back to the zoo.